Welcome to UC Today. My name's David Dungay. Today I'm joined by Richard and Martin from Highlight. Welcome to the show, guys. How are you doing?
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, David. Good to see you.
Fantastic. So today we're going to be talking about service assurance, but particularly around this concept of trust, which is very, very important in this world. But before we get into that conversation, should we do a few introductions? Richard, do you want to kick us off? Tell us a little bit about yourself and the business.
Sure. Highlight's a 20-year-old company now, and our focus is basically helping service providers have better conversations with their customers. Simple as that. We think that service providers have a hard task. It's a very rapidly changing environment, and so what we're about is providing essentially a service assurance platform that gives them a basis for a conversation with their enterprise customers, because good business relationships are based on that conversation. So that's what we do, and the platform we provide is designed to help them specifically in that rather unique environment that service providers inhabit, to build those relationships with their customers. And as the CEO, I'm a fairly engineering-based person. My focus is growing the business and making sure that the product and the technology keeps up.
Fantastic. And Martin?
Yeah. So nice to see you. My name is Martin Saunders. I'm the product director for Highlight. So I'm responsible for Highlight's roadmap. And I go and meet customers and our partners and understand what's going on in their worlds, and try and ensure that Highlight is the best possible platform for them in their world as a service provider. Prior to Highlight, I worked in the service provider industry, so I was 25 years working for service providers before I came to Highlight. So I have a good feel of the world of service providers, and now work for a company that tries to help.
Great. Well, let's start with the big question then. Trust. Tell me, why is trust such an important thing to you? Is trust getting overlooked, and why is it important for service providers, particularly to focus on this? And Richard, do you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, and I can imagine, David, a few people watching this thinking, trust? Why are they banging on about trust? I've got an RFP to get in and the customer wants another 15% off their line rental for this year. And the problem with trust is that it's an intangible. It tends to be overlooked, which is a shame, because every good business relationship is actually based on trust. That's how you build something that's actually long-lasting and solid. The problem that we have in this industry, or that providers have, is that you've got commoditization, you've got rapidly changing technology, you've got price pressure. So the focus inevitably drifts to those things because they are tangible. They're easy to get your head around. Another 5% off the pricing, well, that's an easy thing to calculate. Trust just drifts along. Unfortunately, you end up then with a relationship that's just based on low price and piles of technology, which is not really what providing a service should be about. And it's not what gets you out of bed in the morning, or it shouldn't be. If you can get to that relationship that's actually got a measure of trust through it, then if you think about it, some really good things happen. Firstly, that relationship tends to be stable. You've got a conversation with the other side going, so that when the time comes to renew, it's not a difficult conversation. They'll come to you first, and hopefully you can then keep that relationship going really long term, so it has much more value. And the other thing which people tend to think about less is that by being trusted, you become the go-to person for other requirements that the customer has. If they like you, they get on with you, and this new requirement comes up, we need to update our Wi-Fi. What's all this SD-WAN stuff that we need to talk about? Should we actually take cellular seriously? You've got a much better chance of being the go-to company that they'll come to. So as well as making that relationship longer, it can end up being wider. You've got more depth to it, which is hugely valuable.
Something I'll probably add to that as well is about vulnerability, because I think it's a kind of default position for service providers to assume that they always have to look perfect to their customers, and I think that tends to result in a tendency to be a bit opaque about what's going on in the background, because we know this technology isn't perfect. Connectivity isn't perfect. Lines go wrong. You have all sorts of issues. Sometimes they're the service provider's fault. Sometimes they're the customer's fault. But customers, again, if you're dealing with this as a relationship, you want to know when something's gone wrong. And almost people don't trust when something looks almost a little bit too perfect. So being open about when there are issues, being clear as to why the issue existed, how it was resolved, and what they're going to do next in order to try and make sure that issue doesn't happen again is also a key part of it. So don't hide your failings, as it were. Embrace them and show them. And I think most customers would definitely trust service providers more for doing that.
Okay, well let's talk about service assurance and how that's one of the elements to showing that you're trustworthy as an entity. But I guess the question is, what is that, and how does it help promote this trust?
Good question. So service assurance it's kind of got a bit neglected, we think, in the industry. Again, people tend to focus on the day-to-day and the nuts and bolts and the price of things. Service assurance has all sorts of different definitions depending on where you look it up. But to us, it's about promising what you're going to deliver and then being able to show that you've delivered it. So in the middle, you've got actually delivering it, which to us is service delivery. That's making sure that you're actually doing the job you said you'd do. But service assurance, these two halves, being clear what you're promising, which of course, setting objectives is good in any relationship, and a surprising number of people providing service don't do that. So define what you're going to do, and then crucially, have a way to prove that you've actually delivered that. And that's quite hard, because increasingly what businesses want is that proof delivered in terms they can understand. They don't want a pile of technical reports showing that this parameter was within limits, because the reason they outsource things to you as a service provider was so that they didn't have to think about the technology, not to have it thrown back at them. So it's key to be able to show that you are delivering what you promised in a way they can understand. And if you can do that, then you can start having this conversation that we talked about a moment ago. Right? That's when you have a basis for the conversation, because any discussion is easier when you've got something to talk about. If you've got some good reporting, some good transparency on what's being delivered, then the conversation about it, good or bad, tends to be much easier.
So I'll just pick up the transparency point, because this is something that we've been working really hard on over the last few years. And as Richard has alluded to, the real challenge with this technology is you can be transparent, but you're just transparent in throwing information up on a screen, which has all the nuts and bolts of the technology underneath it. And that's fine, and some engineers like that. But if you're the end customer that's consuming the service, or if you're a more non-technical service-orientated person providing the service, you need to understand how that network and that technology is actually delivering an outcome for the end customer, if you're a service provider, or how it's helping you run your network and run your applications if you're the customer consuming it. So that's transparency has to be very, very carefully done. It needs to be transparent, it needs to be open, but it doesn't have to be every single piece of information that's available. It needs to be particularly tailored for the service that's being provided, in a way that can be understood both by the non-technical people in service providers and for the end customer that's consuming the service. But if you can get that right, we believe we've got that right, it really, really adds to the service being provided. It's a key cornerstone of service assurance.
Yeah, if you can put that transparency in the hands of the people who are actually running the relationship, the business-focused people, it's tremendously empowering, and they feel much more comfortable with what's going on. And that's a crucial difference. So you're not just putting technical results in the hand of the engineers who are keeping the lights on, you're giving it to the people who are running that relationship on both sides, and that's the key enabler here. That's what we're trying to do.
Great. So we've talked about service assurance and how that helps promote trust. Richard, I want to pick up on something you mentioned near the beginning of the conversation around SD-WAN. How is that relevant when it comes to all of this, and why is that relevant?
Yeah, if you want to take one shining example of where all these things come together, It's SD-WAN, because that's clearly the poster child of the network industry at the moment. Everyone's interested in it, lots of vendors jostling for space, and most enterprises now, when they're pushing out an RFP, they are interested in looking at how SD-WAN could help them. And there's the crucial thing. SD is very much sold on the basis of a number of promises. If you move to this technology, it will do these things for you. It will make management much simpler. It will make your applications run more smoothly. It will allow you to use cheaper technology or more reliable composites of technology that will keep the network up more consistently. So there's a bunch of promises that come with SD. And the problem we've found, or that we see our customers having, is that there is no easy way to give proof of delivery of these benefits. Obviously, if you sell a customer on an SD-WAN solution, you want to be able, as time goes on, to illustrate to them in simple terms that it's delivering. And from what we can see, the portals, the software that come with these individual SD solutions, are really not designed for that purpose. They have a number of specific shortcomings. For example, three main ones. One, they're not multi-tenant in the service provider way, so they don't fit nicely into a service provider environment. They don't provide good control over security or managing lots of different customers. That's a big thing. They don't focus on multi-vendor solutions. If you're a provider and you've been able to keep all your customers using just one SD-WAN vendor, then you're doing very well, because most of those guys are ending up with having to support multiple different vendors. Each comes with its own platform, and so their engineers and their salespeople and their service managers are having to engage with multiple different tools, and that's a real problem. Okay. These tools are also quite engineering focused. They have a very technical style of presentation. Again, typically they're designed at the people who are installing and running the network, not the people who are trying to understand that it's delivering. So there's a number of shortcomings there that we're trying specifically to address with Highlight. Martin, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, this has been another area of focus for us over the last few years, and it's been a very interesting one, because initially, when we've been talking to service providers, they've been taking all of this kind of information in from the vendors, and they said, well, we're struggling to understand how Highlight works in this SD-WAN environment. Do I need to have my SD-WAN portal as well as Highlight? Aren't they doing the same thing? And as we sat down with them and looked through these portals and understood how they worked, it was very, very clear that they just weren't designed for service providers. So we obviously get the information out of those portals and bring it in and make it service provider orientated. But there's also the association with the underlay connectivity as well. So in the end, essentially SD-WAN technology is what they would call an overlay. It runs on top of the connectivity or the existing network. And provides benefits on top of that. But in order to really understand what's going on with the whole network, the overlay, as well as what they call the underlay connectivity, the broadband, the Ethernet, the cellular, and possibly the satellite connectivity, you've got to be able to see the two at the same time, because you can see maybe your broadband connection is failing, and you can see that's why my SD-WAN service is having a problem as well. So it's not just the SD-WAN element, but it's also the underlay connectivity piece as well, being able to see that all in one single pane of glass. So by getting the information into Highlight, we can show that view and also focus on the service assurance and focus on the transparency and trust.
Okay, so clearly, SD is opening up businesses, if you like, to a wider range of network technologies. Ultimately, how big a problem is this, for businesses and the technology they're using?
Well, okay, if you were a cynic, you might say that Ethernet was getting boringly reliable, right? It was time for something to come along and introduce a bit of fun into the industry. And that's what SD is doing, really, because it's encouraging people to build networks out of slightly more, let's say, interesting technologies like broadband or cellular or Wi-Fi, with the promise that it will stitch those together for you and build you ultimately a reliable service. that doesn't mean you can stop thinking about those technologies. If the classic one is cellular. If you're trying to manage a large estate of locations, let's say, each of which has a 5G backup, then it's not an unreliable, but it's an unpredictable technology. All sorts of things can happen to 5G. People can or cellular providers can take masks down for reprovisioning or upgrades. Someone can come along and park a delivery lorry just outside the room that's got the 5G router in it. All sorts of things can go wrong with that. If you manage it properly, it can add a huge amount of value into your network, but you do need that visibility. So it's something that you have to be aware of, and as a service provider, you can add a huge amount of value. If you take 5G and you look at the pluses of it, immediate deployment, it provides a great cool backup if you're not using it all the time. The bandwidth is really good. It's incredibly flexible. If you take those and you can manage the yellow lights that come with it and actually present it as a reliable service, that's a fantastic value you can give to your enterprise customers. But you do have to be able to manage it properly. So that's one of the features that we're building into Highlight, this ability to take a big cellular estate and manage it properly. The same with Wi-Fi. You can now start to make Wi-Fi an integral part of your overall network solution. But again, that's vulnerable to interference, microwave ovens, Christmas tree lights, all sorts of things. So you've got to be able to manage it. So yeah, to answer your question, David, Ethernet is a great, reliable technology, and there are others that you can put into an SD solution, but don't assume they'll be as easy to manage as that Ethernet backbone. They need careful looking at.
I'll definitely add that it's almost a perfect storm, these more interesting, we'll call it, I want to call them cheaper, but they're not always cheaper, but these cheaper technologies essentially that have their own kind of attributes and can sometimes be less reliable. That is a bit of a perfect storm for a service provider, because not only are they able to essentially get less revenue, make less money from broadband and cellular connections, because by their nature they're cheaper, they also can be much more expensive to manage. If you don't look after them properly, they'll create more alerts because they go down more, which will keep the service team busy, which will make the customer less happy, which will make more phone calls. All of this all combines together compared to your nice, predictable, reliable, more expensive Ethernet connections that very rarely go wrong. But as Richard says, there is a real opportunity there to do Ethernet, to do broadband and cellular really well. If you do broadband and cellular really well and you manage it properly and you're on top of the estate, you can potentially save your customer quite a lot of money by using this technology, and also open up a whole world of our extra options, where if you've got buildings in the middle of nowhere that's very expensive to get Ethernet to, you may only have broadband or cellular as your main choice. So it's great to have those as part of the portfolio, but as Richard says, you need to look after it properly. Some service providers almost turn off monitoring on broadband connections because they create so much noise. So we have mechanisms in Highlight to avoid doing that. So you have all of this data coming in. And the other point I think I'll make on this piece is, obviously the service provider in the end is ultimately responsible for the provision of that service and the maintenance of that service. But when it comes to things like cellular and broadband, quite often the customer has a part to play in this as well. And that might be, if using the cellular example, that might be because an antenna gets knocked over in a room at the back of the office. It might be that the router has an issue on a broadband connection and just needs to be rebooted. If the customer has all the visibility of what's going on, they can do those things, those kind of first resolution actions themselves, saving potentially the service provider quite a lot of time and effort in doing that. So again, you can do that if you're open and transparent about it. If you keep everything opaque, all the customer can do is phone a service provider and say, "I'm down again." So that transparency in that way is also really important.
I'll give one good illustration of that, to take the cellular concept. The whole 4G, 5G platform is a really well-engineered system, and it's very good at coping with bad environmental conditions. So it has this kind of four-wheel drive mode it'll go into if it starts finding poor signal strength, or this cellular tower's gone down, and it'll just switch around and keep things moving. So as a user, you might not notice that, or you might notice a slight slowdown and just shrug it off. But as a provider, that's indicative perhaps of something that you should be paying attention to. So if you've got transparency on that, if you can see these soft problems happening and the network adjusting but coping, that gives you an opportunity to be proactive, call the customer maybe and say, you know, we're seeing some soft problems here. How about we look at moving your router or switching you to a different SIM or a different provider? And suddenly that level of relationship with the customer, again, that trust thing that we've been talking about, that starts notching up, and you're actually providing a real service rather than just a stack of technology.
Yeah.
That's the kind of relationship that we're trying to help our customers build with their enterprise customers.
Fantastic. So, Richard, Martin, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your insight on this subject.
That's no problem.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Nice to talk to you.
And thank you for watching. You've been watching me, David Dungay, on UC Today. If you liked today's conversation, please give us a like and a share on social media. That's it from me. See you next time.